Good. Now, yes, you have to make yourself more beautiful. Since it is public, it's going to be public. So I don't know, shall we begin, or who is to inaugurate the meeting?
Maybe it's
Is
me.
it
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I should have. Maybe, isn't that correct, Miriam? So I'm hosting the meeting, or at least. So a very warm welcome to everybody, and especially to Father Cyril, who is presenting his paper that has been sent out beforehand to everybody. So the question of Eastern Christian scholasticism as a pseudomorphosis. So this is what we are going to discuss. I don't know if there are any announcements that need to be done before. Do you have anything, Miriam, about the program, the future program? Will continue according to the schedule that has been sent out. And if you have any questions about the schedule, you can always contact Miriam. So, do you want to have a brief introduction, Cyril, to your paper?
Yeah, sure. Right. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to bring up some ideas that I've developed, especially during the quarantine. Essentially, I'm going to reconcile, to vindicate, if you want, scholasticism, which has been labeled as a pseudomorphosis. And well, we all, our generation at least, we began our theological studies, I think, with the idea that scholasticism is something intrinsically, even ontologically bad. It's like a plague, it's like a cancer in the Orthodox theology. It's something that needs to be completely expelled, the anathema of the Orthodox spirituality and theology. And this idea was introduced and promoted in a particular way by Father George Florovsky, who essentially kind of dichotomized the Orthodox theology in a very dualistic way, I would say, by putting, the goats apart from sheep, the kind of ontologically evil scholasticism from ontologically good Eastern Christianity, or Greek patristics, the Holy Hellenism, for which he advocated. This is a very dualistic perception, I believe. It is very dichotomic perception. And my point is that it is very wrong. It is completely wrong, because scholasticism is very much in the nature of the Orthodox theology. I believe I came to a conclusion through my studies, especially during the quarantine, that scholasticism, which has been criticized by Father George Florovsky, essentially constitutes a carcasses of the Orthodox theology. If you remove scholasticism, the entire classical, at least classical theology, just collapses. I've been working on essentially on the entire kind of tradition sequence of the Orthodox theology, Eastern theology, from the 1st century through the 20th century. Let me show what I've done. This is kind of the first part of my work. It's in the revision, drafting, and this is the second part of the same work. And what I tried to do in this work was essentially to demonstrate how important scholasticism is for the Orthodox theology. That if you remove the basic scholastic distinctions, like between the commonality and particularity, then you don't understand the doctrine about the Trinity, about the Incarnation, about the Church, about anything. Everything collapses. Therefore, I believe well, first of all, we need to rehabilitate scholasticism with the Orthodox theology, first thing. And the second thing is that we really need to rethink our Orthodox theology in the terms of scholasticism, because only in this case, case we can properly understand Orthodox theology. Just an example, when Orthodox theology collapses without scholasticism, take the concept of persona, of personhood, which has become very important in the modern theology. We tend to interpret the entire kind of tradition of Eastern Christianity in the terms, through the perspective, through the prism of personhood. This is the so-called personalistic philosophy. And many things have been interpreted in this sense. Like, for instance, even if you take filioque, the issue of filioque, people like Christos Yanaras have interpreted filioque that it is essentially the dividing point between the East and the West. You can explain, the entire Western civilization, even in its secular forms, just by referring to filioque, which is a very personalistic approach, because indeed filioque had to do with the idea of the hypostatic existence of the Spirit, where the Spirit proceeds from the person or from the essence of the Father. It is kind of a personalistic issue, and it was brought to such an extent that people came to believe that filioque has become, the reason of the entire civilizational clash, which is absurd. And this is an indication what happens if you remove the scholastic background basis from the Orthodox theology. You end up with very strange ideas like this one. Florovsky, as we know, has criticized scholasticism as pseudomorphosis, and to a great extent, if you apply, Freudian psychoanalytics, you can probably interpret his scholasticism as kind of self-criticism, his attempt at self-psychoanalysis, because he himself was very much divided. He was divided ideologically, and I indicate in my article that he was wrestling all his life with his Eurasian legacy. He was a very devoted, fervent Eurasian in the early career, in his 30s. Then he ostensibly denounced Eurasianism as an ideological kind of platform. But I argue that he sublimated his ideological Eurasianism to his concept of neo-patristic synthesis. And he all the time, kind of struggled within himself with the Eurasian legacy, with scholasticism as, well, he was a very much Western kind of thinker. He adopted the methods of historical criticism from the West, and at the same time he was very much anti-Western, and all these kind of difficulties, controversies existed within himself. Not the least thing that he had an internal struggle between an inner Russian and inner Ukrainian. His mother was Ukrainian, And well, he probably spoke Ukrainian and he hated Ukraine. We could call him nowadays as a kind of a proponent of the Russian world, I believe. So he accused Ukraine of introducing scholasticism and pseudomorphosis to Russia, and to a great extent it was also an internal strife. He actually tried to overcome his internal kind of scholasticism by criticizing it. As a good Ukrainian myself, I want to reintroduce scholasticism, something that Florovsky accused Ukrainians of all the time, trying to smuggle. The Ukrainians are smugglers of scholasticism, during the centuries to the Orthodox soil and trying to spoil the Orthodox people with scholasticism. I will do the same. I'll try, and in my article, I actually, as a good Ukrainian, I try to smuggle scholasticism back to the Orthodox, innocent pastures of the Orthodox theology and to spoil those pastures with scholasticism. But I believe that is the only way, because that is the essence of the framework, the carcasses of the Orthodox theology. And well, I will not explain you why and how, because, well, I very kind of episodically I did it in my article. I hope to present it in more detail in this kind of huge book that I'm working on. And I hope there will be more opportunities to discuss the role of scholasticism in the Orthodox theology, well, in the frame of our school, maybe in the future seminars. So that's where I would like to stop my introduction, and I'd like to then to proceed to the discussions and criticism.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for quite a provocative start. Although perhaps you are not having your most.
That's my hobby, to be provocative.
Yeah, but maybe you don't have the audience that are most provoked. But let us start with the discussion and get some reactions, questions, and comments. Anyone who would like to, you can raise your hand, or there is a way of doing that through a reaction in the raising hands like I do now.
Maybe Dafor should start, as we normally do. He's the opponent.
Yeah. If Dafor knows what to do, then Dafor can start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, first of all, Cyril, for this paper and for those provocative thoughts. I would just add at the beginning, well, basically to rephrase what you already said as a context for my response, to just say that at least in this paper, if I understood correctly, then this paper that was sent out was a kind of digested form of your argument that will appear in a much bigger form in the book.
Well, actually, this paper was presented at a theological conference in Volos in Greece just a year ago in February 2020. And I elaborated it into a chapter which will be published as the proceedings of the conference. But essentially, the arguments I developed to a great extent in the book project.
Right. Right. Yeah, because many things, I suppose, that are here left just indicated or just mentioned will be developed, and that will be also interesting to actually see the elaboration of these things. So at the beginning, I would like to say that I realized when I was reading the paper that I'm probably not the best person to respond to it, because I'm by no standards an expert in scholasticism or Aristotle. So I'll do my best to just raise a couple of questions or give a couple of observations, and most of those things that I'll present or say, even if they're put as statements, you should understand them as questions that we can then later discuss and go more in depth. So within this general framework of the argument, so the argument basically, if I'm portraying it correctly, is saying that yes, there is this anti-Western element to Florovsky, and then there is this anti-scholasticism position. And then actually, if we go back and also to the patristic era that Florovsky often counterpositions as the Orthodox way as opposed to scholasticism, we actually find there scholasticism again. So therefore, the whole contrasting between them is not really substantiated or cannot be done in such a way. And what came to me as the first question when I was reading the paper was that I wasn't sure about actually the definition of scholasticism there, because it seems to me that it either needs to be more specific, or it allows for, as it is now, at least what's in the paper, it allows for so many different possibilities for finding scholasticism in so many places that the definition becomes almost useless. And from what I could find in the paper on pages like 5, and then later on or somewhere earlier page yes, so there's another one that, so page 10, so 5 and 10, the definition that you use for this purpose circulates around understanding scholasticism. So like in sentence on page 5, in other words, the bottom line of the scholastic method is the differentiation between particularities and commonalities, as well as taxonomies in which commonalities are sorted out. So one element is the distinction between particularities and commonalities. And another concept is that reliance on Aristotelian categories. So that it seems that these are used as the elements in order to identify the presence of scholasticism. Now the question, if that's the case, the question becomes, how is scholasticism, or is scholasticism of the late medieval or early modern period specific or different from those other scholasticism that we could identify using such an approach? Because scholasticism is such a strongly rooted method or phenomenon within the Christian theology and also Western culture in general, that it seems to me that if the concept is broadened or used in a somewhat different fashion, then there should be a very solid elaboration in order to see how is that possible. What seems to me is that scholasticism, this proto-modern or late medieval scholasticism, certainly fits this broad definition, but is also much more specific. So that, and that would be then my question: is every use of usage of Aristotelian categories scholastic, and is every differentiation between particularities and commonalities scholastic? Because I can think of, or at least I think I can think of many differentiations between these things, probably also using Aristotelian categories that I don't think necessarily qualify for scholasticism. Is it only scholasticism here reduced to a particular method, or also do we include into our understanding of scholasticism the consequences of scholasticism as a historical phenomenon? Because I think that although scholasticism represents a response to certain adaptation of Aristotelian categories, it also has certain consequences that I have some troubles finding across the range of authors that might have utilized some of Aristotelian categories or who made a distinction between particularities and commonalities. For instance, just to try to be a little more specific. So it seems problematic also to try to come up with a very good definition of scholasticism, even for just the historical phenomenon in the West, because of course there are these different streams within scholasticism. But one of the most common ways of approaching it is to see scholasticism as a form of realism. So it becomes then not so much the focus of scholasticism, the differentiation between particularities and commonalities, but rather how these commonalities or particularities are understood. And in scholasticism, these universals are understood as something that has real existence. So that's why but the problem is that then it is further developed in the sense that those universals are a reflection or a divine reason made manifest to the human being, or even more specifically, one might say, to the human knowledge or human reason. And that's why it allows for the investigation of nature as a way of approaching God. And it also allows then for actually, which it ultimately ended up in, promoting natural theology as a way of knowing God's creation even without the help of the revelation, which is one of those reasons why actually there was a strong reaction to that. And then, of course, there is the position of logic within this system as a mediator between divine reason and human reason. And then there is, in this more specific sense, scholasticism understood as a method where things are summarized in a sense to avoid contradictions between different authors. And yes, in this sense, I suppose it can be stretched to different historical periods and different approaches. But in this particular context in the West, it also responded to particular concerns and to newly available Aristotelian readings and so on and so forth. So it seems to be, to me, the first question would be the problem of the definition. I don't think that those two criteria are sufficient to identify scholasticism, and that it begs, because if they are, then it begs actually distinction between Aristotelian categories or the various adaptations of Aristotelian categories and Platonism. It becomes very obscured whether Plato's, it seems almost as if what you're saying is that Plato's ideas and Aristotelian categories are one and the same, or that Plato's ideas fit Aristotelian categories. But I doubt that can be defended. Of course, there is Neo-Platonist synthesis you talk about that try to resolve these contradictions. But the question nevertheless remains, because if we go back to the definition, the very differentiation between particularities and universals, it can be found also in pure Platonism, even before Aristotle. So then if we stretch the definition so much, then we risk to call Plato even scholastic. And at that point, everyone in the Western tradition of philosophy becomes scholastic. So it becomes a kind of a universal conceptual framework, which is very difficult to escape. So that would be the first part. Related to that, I would just like also you to comment on a couple of things that appear on pages 14, 15, and 16. So when you talk about how Cappadocians adopted Aristotelian categories, it's not very clear whether you are saying that a distinction between the essence and hypostasis is a distinction between the universal and the particular, understood in a similar way in which early modern scholastics understand it. Because if it's similar, it seems it undermines actually the argument here. Because a realist universalist position would imply that particularities lack this ontic or ontological. We don't need to go that specific into terminology, but ontic/ontological, whatever we choose for this particular case, realism. And that's not what Cappadocians were doing, as you know better than I. So they might have used some categories or some concepts that exploit the universal versus particular, but without the ontic implications that this distinction, how this distinction appears in some more specific Aristotelian or scholastic contexts. So this is also the question whether here, how this metaphysical baggage creeps into these concepts or not. And that's related to your another comment at the end of page 14 and beginning of page 15. The reason why Christian theologians appropriated the dialectical method of Aristotle and his later Neoplatonic commentators was their concentration on logic and not metaphysics. And then you continue, Christian theologians rejected most of the classical metaphysics, but embraced most of the classical dialectics. That was the main reason why Porphyry became so popular in Christian theology. Well, the question here really becomes, again, goes back to Aristotelian categories. There is a huge debate, and it's totally unclear whether Aristotelian categories were something related to things or something that's sometimes called extramental or inframental or to language. It can be, it seems that you can interpret Aristotelian categories in all three different ways. And depending on how you interpret them, then the consequences are metaphysical, rhetorical, or language related, or epistemological. And it seems here that probably some of the authors did both, using the logic, but then also up to a point adopting them also to imply real things or metaphysical categories. And in this sense, then they also responded to Aristotelian categories in different ways. And then the question becomes also which one of them is actually a scholastic or not. The second sentence after this, logic and metaphysics, when you say Christian theologians rejected most of the classical metaphysics, I'm not sure I know whether they did or not. I don't know. What seems remarkable, and it's been there for a very long time, is a similarity between certain types of Neoplatonism and Christian developments of the doctrine. And in that case, it's not the rejection of metaphysical categories and metaphysics, but precisely either its modification or just developing it in parallel. For a very long time, there was this dogma that the Christians, under the influence of Neoplatonism, developed their categories. Because it's similar. When you read Plotinus, it almost looks like you read about Trinitarian theology, but it's not clear, and I don't think it has been demonstrated. Maybe those whose specialty is more related to those first centuries could actually would know certainly better the current literature on that. But it doesn't seem. I haven't been convinced that we can demonstrate clearly that it is, for example, the influence of Plotinus on Christians as much as it could be reliance on earlier sources of both early Christian theologians and Plotinus. But in any case, what we find there is clearly metaphysical stuff. It's an attempt to articulate, again, using particularities and commonalities, but to refer to metaphysical stuff. And then you find it in the Christian context, of course, with adaptations and some more specific flavor. So that would be another point. And then finally, I think that would be all in this first round. When you mentioned on page 16, quote, if we apply Florovsky's words that Hellenism had been, quote, dissected with a sword of Christian revelation, and quote, then this dissection separated pagan metaphysics from the metaphysically neutral dialectics. Now the question here becomes, of course, whether dialectics can ever be neutral. I'm not sure that logic can be neutral, and for dialectics, I'm pretty sure that it's very difficult to come to that. Of course, that doesn't mean that they did not perceive it as neutral or more neutral, ideologically free, so to say, to make it useful for their own purposes. I'm pretty convinced that might be the case. But the question then remains again, in any dialectics procedure, there is the surrounding the broader ideological context which shapes it, frames it. So there is dialectics in the context of early modern scholasticism, but that dialectics is shaped by the concerns that they had at the beginning of the modern age. And it's certainly different from dialectics used by early church fathers. And one consequence to conclude that, where I think you are very right when you detect Florovsky, this anti-Western position, just as a question or a proposal, whether this anti-Western position was because of scholasticism as such primarily, or because of the consequences of scholasticism, at least the way Florovsky perceived them. And Florovsky was not the only one. There is actually, we can list probably hundreds of names of those who actually responded negatively to scholasticism because they perceived the scholasticism method, the way, again, it was conceived at the end of the Middle Ages, necessarily led into secularization. That the method they applied, the premises, how they dealt with premises, actually ended up in effectively making God pretty much irrelevant for either an epistemological procedure, for our knowledge of the world, or for our interactions with the world. That wasn't probably a necessary conclusion, but there was a perception that this was the direction indicated by scholasticism. And then ultimately, of course, the Protestant Reformation finally was an attempt to respond to that. So probably and I don't know, I also don't know Florovsky so much in detail to be able to tell, but maybe you know whether this fear that scholasticism necessarily results in one form of secularization was the reason for Florovsky to be so critical, more than a priori just being anti-West. So that would be all for now.
Okay, Cyril, now you have a chance to reply.
Good. Thank you, Davor, for very thorough analysis of the paper. Of course, it will be difficult to respond to all the issues and concerns that you mentioned. I'll try to address some of them. Maybe I'll go, backward from the end to the beginning of your analysis. Well, it's quite surprising that I think Florovsky didn't criticize contemporary secularism as an output of the product of scholasticism. For him, scholasticism led just to the deviation within the Orthodox theology, not to secularism as such. Even though I agree with your point that scholasticism can be considered as a way, as a doorway to secularism. I would agree with that, exactly because scholasticism was envisaged in the beginning as a metaphysically neutral instrument. So if you use something, so to say, religiously clean, with no, no stain of religion on it, so to say, then this secular instrument turns into the instrument of secularization, right? You see what I mean? So originally, yes, scholasticism was envisaged as a secular instrument, as much secular as it was possible in the time when there was no secularity, in the period of late antiquity. And exactly for the reason that scholasticism brought from the Neoplatonic metaphysics primarily some useful instruments to be implemented to the Orthodox theology. Why this instrument was metaphysically neutral, and why scholasticism, excuse me, I need to switch off my messenger. Why scholasticism was valid for that? Because Neoplatonism, unlike, well, we perceive nowadays Platonism or Neoplatonism as one of those, nice philosophical schools. Just like today, nowadays, we think about what we think about existentialism or personalism, some kind of secular, systems of thinking. But neither Neoplatonism nor Platonism were like that. They were very much religious kind of things, systems of beliefs, where philosophy was not separated from religion. Moreover, unlike Platonists, classical Platonists, Plato himself, he was not probably a very much devoted, pagan. He was more like a secular thinker nowadays. But Neoplatonics, they were just mad. They were fanatical polytheists. Like, for instance, Plotinus or Porphyry, they were regular churchgoers to the sacrifices. They sacrificed, animals. They liked burning animals, sacrificing to gods, and they were very much devoted to their gods. And essentially, they developed some of their categories as a response to this religious experience. Like, for instance, they invented the idea of hierarchy in order exactly to sort out different gods in their pantheon. They were very religious people with very strong polytheistic metaphysics. That's why Christianity, when Christianity dealt with the Platonism in the form of Neoplatonism, what we call nowadays Neoplatonism, they dealt with a very religiously charged package, full dance with religion and kind of other philosophy. That's why they had to cut through this package, to extract from this package something that they could use without compromising their monotheism. That's why they extracted these categories exactly to serve their monotheistic cause. And they extracted categories, scholastic categories, as religiously neutral or secular, in modern terms, instruments. And again, I agree with you, Davor, that nowadays scholasticism probably just contributed to the secularization of modern Christian, societies or theology, whatever you call it, because of its neutral status of these instruments in the beginning. Speaking about the definition, the rest of your concerns have to do, in my judgment, more or less with the definition of scholasticism. Indeed, it's very confusing. It's almost as there are as many or so many definitions of scholasticism, or could be so many definitions of scholasticism, that we will be unable to define it whatsoever at all. So it's like try to define freedom, or try to define logics nowadays. It's impossible. It's kind of too many people are aware about these categories in order to come to a bottom line in defining those categories. That's why essentially I try to figure out what could be the bottom line of scholastics. And as I studied, the evolution of scholasticism, because certainly scholasticism evolved, I realized that its roots go further back than the Western scholasticism. And indeed, nowadays, kind of a common perception, which, well, you demonstrated, Davor, somehow is that it is essentially a Western phenomenon which emerged in the medieval West, and people actually built their understanding of scholasticism on this concept that it was born in the West. That was the mistake of Florovsky as well, I believe, because he perceived scholasticism as a Western product. I believe that the scholasticism, Christian scholasticism, emerged much before the Western scholasticism, at least 7 centuries before it. And in theology, it was introduced by the Cappadocians, essentially, even more than by Athanasius himself. Athanasius was not so much aware about the instruments of the Neoplatonic logics. Of course, there was Middle Platonism in the time of Athanasius, but he was not much aware, as far as we know from the sources, about the instruments offered by the Neoplatonic scholasticism. So essentially, it was Cappadocians, and I believe that the bottom line, there are many definitions, there are many perceptions and interpretations what scholasticism could be, but I believe that the differentiation between different categories is the bottom line of all scholasticism in the world. It's essentially this insight of Aristotle to sort things out. That what is his great contribution to the modern thinking is that he saw a variety of things around us, as we do, right? We see, like, around me nowadays are hundreds of things. What Aristotle did, he just reduced this multiplicity of things to fewer things, to fewer categories. That was his basic insight. And this is essentially, it remains to be the basic insight of all sorts of scholasticism in the world. It's about reducing the number of things around us to a fewer categories by which we can describe those things, and we could establish commonalities between those things. That is essentially the bottom line of all logical dialectical systems. It was not, of course, introduced by Aristotle. It was perfected by Aristotle. And you're right that Plato started it even before him. That's why it's it was noticed. Actually, I found a very interesting observation in the late Byzantine literature. They managed to identify in the late Byzantium that the Plato's ideas correspond to Aristotle's commonalities, with the difference that for Aristotle, commonalities were just concepts in our mind. For Plato, ideas were real, and they underpinned, all things around us. And there was also why the metaphysical kind of this charge was important for the early Christians. Why the Cappadocians, for instance, took some categories with some precautions. In Plato, to a great extent than in Aristotle, ideas were much more important than things which were underpinned by ideas, as we know, right? For Plato, ideas are the real things above us, and the manifestations of those ideas, the things like this notebook, it's much less valuable than the idea of this notebook somewhere in the heaven, right? So there is a hierarchy between the categories. The commonality for Plato was more important than this particularity. What the Cappadocians tried to do, and they made this metaphysical correction, they introduced the idea that both the commonality and the particularity have the same value, at least when they apply to God. That's why they said that the hypostasis as a commonality is equal with the essence of God. You cannot say that 3 hypostases of the Trinity are more important than one essence of the Trinity. Or that one essence of the Trinity is more important than 3 hypostases of the Trinity, something that Plato would have said, right? So the Cappadocians exactly equalized established equilibrium between those categories, and that was a major metaphysical correction of the original Platonic categories. By the way, nowadays, in the frame of the modern kind of personalistic theology, we see how this equilibrium is distorted again, because the personalistic approach values the person's hypostasis more than the essence. That's why essentially, from the personalistic view, the three persons of the Trinity are more important than one essence. As a personality of a human being is more important than just a nature. Essentially, the modern personalistic philosophy adopted the approach opposite to the Platonic. For the Platonists, the commonality was more important than particularity. For modern Platonism, particularities are more important than the commonality, the nature. And both approaches, I think, are wrong from the perspective, at least from the perspective of the classical Christian theology. That's why I believe that this kind of approach to scholasticism as a differentiation between different categories, and the most important categories being commonality and particularity. There are other categories. Plato had a dozen of categories. Then Porphyry boiled them down to 5 boches, 5 categories. But it's a different question how many categories there are. The kind of the core of these categories is the differentiation between the commonalities and particularities. That's why I believe that the method of this differentiation gives us a key to understand better our own theology, classical theology, to understand better its difference from, say, Neoplatonism or Platonism, because it's another big issue nowadays. People tend to confuse, Platonism and Christianity. People tend to speak about Christian Neoplatonism, which is nonsense. If you would say to the Christian Neoplatonists that, hey, you guys, you know that you are Christian Neoplatonists, they would say, no, you are crazy, we are not. Because no one believed at the time that they were Christian Neoplatonists, those who are called nowadays as Christian Neoplatonists. And I believe there is a huge difference between Neoplatonism and Christianity. We can count only a couple of really kind of Platonic theologians who can be called Christian Neoplatonists, like I believe Dionysius the Areopagite was one of them, or for instance, to some extent, John Philoponus, but he was more Neo-Aristotelian than Neoplatonic. The rest of the so-called Neoplatonists were just, Christian theologians who used some helpful ideas and lexems, linguistic constructions from the Neoplatonic philosophy, including Maximus, including John of Damascus, Anastasius of Sinai, including Severus of Antioch, another great theologian who used the categories, but without confusing those categories, Neoplatonic metaphysics with the Christian theology. So I think it's a helpful method if you want. It's a key. I know that it will cause a lot of questions, and you already raised those questions, Davor. I'm grateful for that, about the validity of that method. But I suggest it as a helpful instrument to restore the original kind of Christian thinking about theological matters, to criticize modern developments. I'm quite critical about modern kind of post-scholastic Orthodox theology. And I believe it's so confusing, really. I myself, I was a proponent of this post-scholastic theology because before I came to understand the scholastic framework, and now I see from the perspective of my neo-scholastic kind of thinking how confusing was the post-scholastic, modern theology. I'm not critical about it overly, but I think that it's helpful to use to reapply this old instrument, long forgotten instrument, to reevaluate what we think about modern theology in order to recalibrate it somehow. Yeah, that would be my response.
Thank you, Cyril. So we'll give others a chance also to comment and ask.
If I can just a couple of
Stafford first, yes.
Yeah, just a couple of to what Cyril said now. Just a couple of questions, really, or maybe suggestions. It seems logical to find some similarities between scholasticism as a historical phenomenon and a theological approach that evolved in the West within a particular historical cultural context, and some earlier writings, because if both everything that kind of goes back to Aristotle, of course, will reflect some of these things and will have similarities. So then the question becomes, would it be better, to avoid confusion, to just call it Aristotelianism, or various adaptations of Aristotle, or various using Aristotle in various ways, rather than scholastic? Because then I think many of these issues could be resolved, because it would be clear that Aristotle then is the source, and then whoever then used his categories, reflected upon them, could be actually put, including scholasticism, but not reduced to scholasticism. So that would be the first question or suggestion. Second, and this is really interesting, the comparison between Plato, Aristotle, and then what Christians made out of it. You're right that in a certain sense, viewed from a Platonic perspective, what Cappadocians did was expanding the concept of real, or using real also in reference to things that Plato wouldn't be happy with. But the problem there becomes that the distinction between Aristotle and Plato is not probably just the fact that he was much more specific about the categories he was using. So reducing those appearances to a certain number of categories. One reason for that is that with Plato, we are pretty certain, there are some places that can be debated and so on and so forth, but we are pretty certain that his understanding of ideas implies this, some kind of ontological realism, where universals or commonalities are given ontological priority. That's absolutely not clear in Aristotle. So if and I think I'm correct, if I'm not, please somebody should correct me, but Aristotle never mentions in categories what these categories are. Whether they're things, whether they're concepts, whether they are just terms. And that would be a huge distinction then, when how Cappadocians and everybody else used or relied on both Aristotle and Plato, because when they used certain categories, such as to differentiate the universal and the particular, or common and particular in the case of essence person dispute, they were both used with an ontic content. So both of them are ontically belong to ontic realism. That's absolutely not clear that Aristotelian categories had the same function. So Cappadocians, or most of others, I suppose, better in the patristic era, would actually, the conflict part of the problem was to make a distinction, whether explicitly or implicitly, I think more often implicitly, between the level of terms and language that's used, and then what language refers to. And one of those radical attempts to do that is, of course, apophatic theology. But in a certain sense, that also is an anti-Aristotelian project. So I have there difficulties seeing how actually something that I think even Cappadocians could be placed in the apophatic category, just like a more elaborate apophatic theologians who actually try to conceptualize, try to be specific, but the bottom line is to say, well, still the language we use, the concepts we used, they are just there as symbols that refer to certain realities, and these realities have an ontic content, and there the distinction between commonality and particularity is not at all similar to the distinction that scholastics made in the early modern period. And my final then question there would be, can we then, avoid scholasticism at all if we follow the path that you proposed? It seems that it's in a certain sense unavoidable in Christian theology. So what would be a way out, or is actually Aristotelianism / scholasticism the method of Orthodox or Christian theology?
Well, I'll try to respond briefly, Samuel, if you allow me to.
Yeah, we'll give others a chance also, but
Right.
please, briefly.
Yeah, briefly. Thank you. Well, first of all, we probably can avoid scholasticism and we can build another theological system. But what we can't is we cannot understand the 2000 years of the Christian theology without scholasticism. Or maybe not 2000, maybe 100, I don't know, 1,500 years of Christian theology. So this legacy is understandable properly only in the framework of scholasticism. About the apophatism of Cappadocians, I certainly believe that the Cappadocians were more apophatic than Eunomius, for instance, but certainly they were not as apophatic as, for instance, Vladimir Lossky believed them to be. Another kind of, I think, misleading concept of apophatism in the classical theology, but I'm not going to explore it in detail. And the final remark about the Aristotelian logics. Actually, yes, you can call it, sometimes I myself call it Aristotelian logic. But the thing is that by the time of Christianity, Aristotle had been completely forgotten. No one remembered except, a couple of people who was that guy. And then he re-emerged in the 2nd century all of a sudden, and then Neoplatonic philosophy brought it up, Aristotle. And essentially the logical apparatus of Aristotle was reappreciated in the Neoplatonic thinking, particularly in the writings of Porphyry, who, as I mentioned, he was a very kind of staunch anti-Christian critic. He was stauncher than Celsus was. And he produced a wonderful commentary on Aristotle. And this commentary was exactly appropriated by the Christian philosophical or theological logics. That's why I call this Christian scholasticism Aristotelian Porphyrian, because it went through the palms of Porphyry, was passed to the Christian theology. And then generations of Christian logicians, dialecticians elaborated on this and produced manuals of logics. I just want to show you some Armenian manuals. When I was in Yerevan some 5 years ago, so I bought, in the flea market, some old books from the publication from the 60s. It's a Russian translation of the different Armenian treatises on Aristotle, like including this one. It's called Interpretation of the Categories of Aristotle, translated into Armenian, now in Russian. It was recently only published in English. Or this one is a translation of Porphyry, and this is the translation of David the Invincible, another Neoplatonist, Christian Neoplatonist who lived in Alexandria, and he became an intellectual hero of the Armenians. You can still go to Yerevan and find his statue of David the Invincible somewhere in the central plate in Yerevan. So all those were the stages of appropriation of the Aristotelian Porphyrian logics into the Christian realm. That's why, you can say that it is Aristotelian, but I would say it is just a Christian logics or Christian scholasticism. And originally it was Eastern. It was written in Greek. Then it was transmitted to Syriac. Then from Syriac by the Christian theologians, people like Theodor Abukura, to Arabian, and we have wonderful Arabic treatises, not Muslim, but Christian. Then they were transmitted further to the Islamic theology, and then it ended up in the West, contributing to the Western scholasticism. So it was a very long route by the Orient to the Western scholasticism, and Western scholasticism emerged just much later as a final kind of product or maybe byproduct of the Eastern scholasticism.
Thank you, Cyril. So now we'll open the screen or our digital space for other comments and reflections or questions. Yes, Michael?
So very interesting, both the paper and the discussion. And at last, I had some real discussion. That's what I've been waiting for a year or two more.
That's why we are so provocative.
Yeah. Anyway, I do think I agree with Cyril that anti-scholasticism is a creation born from a kind of Occidentalism. But I would like to make it a little bit more complicated. Alistair Bonnet, he's a famous thinker in this field. He argues that both Occidentalism and Orientalism is a myth-making dependent on the power of controlling the image of other. But when it comes to these Western Orthodox thinkers, I don't think it's the power of controlling the other which is at stake here. I think it's a reconstruction of a reality that has never existed. And like you recreate your imagined world in order to fit into a Western world. And that fits very well with what Bonnet is arguing for the Japanese factor, because he's arguing that the Japanese, they lost their high culture for, due to the Second World War and so on. So they were forced to recreate the Japanese culture as a kind of anti-culture to the West in order to raise their own, honor and so on. I think the same thing applies here for Western Orthodox thinkers, that an imagined Orthodox high culture has been lost, depending on both, the communists, but also the Tsar Peter the Great world, where oppressed the church. So during this era, beginning already in Romanticism, this imagined, lost Byzantine world was recreated in the minds of these Western Orthodox thinkers. And especially it was fueled by being in a different world, where they could actually reconstruct the world which they didn't live in. They can, so to say, idealize a world that wasn't present. And this effect, I do think, created the idea of original Christianity based on emotions, like the Romanticism, where it fitted this anti-scholastic scheme very neatly. It produced this idealized way of being spiritual human beings, so to say. That's my, at least, the complicated a little bit more, but I fully agree otherwise with that part. But the risk here is that this, let's say, Orientalism that they created is also a myth-making of the West. An idealization later on, when it comes back as a boomerang later on, and then suddenly we have a kind of birth bifurcation. You have the myth-making of the West and the myth-making of the East, so to say. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Michael. Other...
I just briefly respond
on this, Cyril?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I completely agree with you, Michael. And that's a great approach through Orientalism versus Occidentalism. In the United States, they call it post-Protestant syndrome. It's a bit kind of pejorative for people who convert, from Episcopalians or Methodists disappointed in their liberal kind of confessions to Orthodoxy. And they tend to, demonize their former confessions and to idealize their Orthodox confession. That's the root of the culture wars, which are so ferocious in the United States nowadays. Because, those wars are waged by people who have demonized, the West, even though they are Westerners, and who have idealized the East. And in the case of Florovsky, who was very much a person of the Western culture, to his bones, and yet he was so sophisticated, anti-Westerner, that he borrowed this idea of pseudomorphosis actually from another Westerner. And I was surprised to find the reference to pseudomorphosis, the idea of pseudomorphosis in Spengler, in his The Decline of the West. where he criticized being a Westerner. He criticized the West, the Western civilization. That's why he's so much loved in modern Russia. And he was appropriated by Florovsky in his theological construction of pseudomorphosis. Another kind of similar figure that I find very similar to this case is the figure of Yanaras. He is the most Western thinker that you can imagine in modern Greece. His ethos, he's so sweet, he's so polite in a very Western way, not very Greek way at all. And yet he's such a staunch anti-Western, criticist. This is exactly this phenomenon that you've indicated, Michael.
Thank you. I like to intervene. I agree on this, and I think this is the strength of your paper, Cyril, and I agree with Michael, but I actually very much agree with Dafor that there is a problem. When I read your paper, the definition of scholasticism, I think your use of the word scholasticism and the concept is very problematic, because it's not the general use. If you look into encyclopedias of definition of scholasticism, it has to do with the growth of the Western medieval universities and their tradition. Because if you put scholasticism as anything that distinguishes between commonalities and particularities, then of course all thinking, all language is scholastic, in the sense that we use words, the same word for different particular things. So I think the definition becomes too wide and thus less helpful. It is as, I think the problem is perhaps, I agree that the roots of what we usually call scholasticism, that is combined with Thomas of Aquinas and so on, the roots are in Aristotle. I agree on that. But if you start to define a thing by its roots, you get into real problems, because the roots are often manifold and are not exactly the thing that developed later, because so many things have common roots. So I think I agree with Dafor that it would be easier to follow your argument if you were more specific in the definition and did not use scholasticism as widely as you do, because it comes to designate so many different things, like Protestant scholasticism, Catholic, medieval scholasticism, modern, Aristotle, and the differences between these are then blurred. I think that is a problem. So that's my first comment. I do have another one also, but perhaps one at a time. And maybe Cyril and then Michael wants to reply to that.
I just briefly say that I completely agree that probably it's vague, and probably I have to reduce the definition to the distinction between the categories underpinned by the differentiation between the commonality and particularity in the sense envisaged by Aristotle and his commentators. That would be probably a more correct definition.
Michael, you wanted to say something here too on this?
Yeah, how would I say it in a simple sense now? If you take Stelios Ramphos, Cyril, he creates a kind of, bifurcation between scholasticism and a kind of what he thinks an ideal type of Christian thinking or whatever. But the thing is that what he was criticized of was that his definitions also failed. I think the problem is that scholasticism as a concept is part of a myth making. It means that it's not possible to define. It's a word that is used in a very precise context, either positively or negatively. And it depends on that context so intimately. And that's why Ramphos in his interview in the Greek television, was almost trapped in this discussion, simply because he wanted to define scholasticism in one way, but it's always a second or third or fourth way of describing scholasticism. But one thing that I do think is important is the negative interpretation, or let's say the idealized interpretation of Gregory Palamas, who actually was far from a description of a kind of anti-Western thinker. He was very dependent on Western thinking. And this maybe is what I do think that Ramphis is wrong in, is completely wrong in this, that he tries to idealize certain thinkers and they are not so different from Western thinking. Maybe that's the key towards this discussion, that we have created boundaries between East and West that doesn't exist simply.
I agree.
That's a part of the myth making, so to say. That's.
I do agree, and I think Håkan Gunnarsson's dissertation on Palamas is very good for this. So I agree with you, Michael.
That's why I also agree that Neo-Palamism, as a continuation of the neo-patristic synthesis, is just another ideological product.
But then, and I think Michael is correct that the concept of scholasticism belongs to a myth-making where it is a loaded term, positively or negatively. But then when you write and you use it yourself, you have to be very clear on this. Otherwise, it becomes a bit blurred if you're using it in a distinct sense or as part of the myth-making.
You know, I've been often accused that I deconstruct myths by producing new myths. That's something I'm doing right now. I'm not sure. I think Johannes tried to reach.
Yes. I don't see you very well, Johannes. It's so dark. But
yeah, I have light in the background, but
yeah,
now.
sure.
Thank you, Cyril, for a very interesting article from which I learned many new things, and that's a lot. Thank you. I was also thinking very much in line with Davor and Samuel here, and even Michael, that scholasticism, there's even one more problem with it, because when we think of scholasticism as a Western kind of period or school of thought, it really represents something else. It was how to say, the culturally dominant school of thought in Western Europe for a very long time. It represents something that the fathers of the 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th centuries never really encountered, because they live in the post-Constantine era and were actually free to relate to Aristotle and the ancient philosophy in any way they wanted. So they were kind of able to pick and choose the best things from it, and which is what they also did. But the scholastic thinkers of Western Europe, they were not. They were given things, and they were kind of schooled in a certain method and thinking from the beginning, and it makes the term so very complicated. It raises, and you can make your paper and the whole thesis much better if you really take this into consideration. Yeah, that's very much my point.
Thank you, Johannes. On the Cappadocians, I think this was an interesting discussion also, because as far as I understand, when they use and they distinguish between ousia and hypostasis, and you speak about this as creating an equilibrium, but then I think it's clear for them, you couldn't in a modern say ousia was simply a concept in our mind. Now, of course, it depends on what you think about the concept. What is a concept? And maybe that isn't helpful, but the intellectual or the noetic in their thinking had not only a reality that we do not give the word concept today, but it also had a priority. And I think this question of direction is, so to say, the noetic or the concept prior, or just an abstraction from, creates a real difference between the Cappadocian and at least a more modern form of nominalism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I believe that we can be quite lost in exploring the Cappadocian ideas. For instance, for the Cappadocian, they use the word epinia or epinoia, if you prefer, exactly to identify the concepts. And for them, epinia is not something real; it's something only noetic, right? It has to do with the word nous. But it's interesting. I found in Maximus an idea that the universal ideas are not just ideas; they are things. And actually, his idea of logos, something that has been pre-scheduled by God as a blueprint for the creation, and which exists in reality, it's a reference to the medieval universalism, if you want. I was very much surprised. I always thought that Maximus was a nominalist, but essentially his concept of logi is very universal. So we can find the roots of all those medieval discussions between universalists and nominalists in the kind of late antique Byzantine theology. That's why I think that's not very correspondent what the Cappadocians thought and what Maximus was thinking. But it's kind of a difficult topic certainly to explore, and their idea of idea was certainly different from our idea of idea.
So, if there is no one else, I would also like, there is one figure, of course, that doesn't appear in your paper at all, and that's Dionysius.
Oh, because I hate him so much.
Okay.
I'm really obsessed with Dionysius, maybe to an unhealthy extent. That's why probably I restrain myself, not to refer to him too much. But he will appear many times in my book.
As a scholastic?
Not really. No, I don't believe that he was really a scholastic in the Aristotelian sense. He was very much more Platonic. In the way that Plato was different from Aristotle. We know that he was not very much different, but he certainly was different, and I agree with Davor that there is a huge difference. And while the rest of the Christian Neoplatonists try to keep balance, well, to be actually distanced from all of them, from Plato and Aristotle in the same way, on the same distance, Dionysius certainly tilted to Plato in many ways. And I believe that he was probably the only properly Neoplatonic thinker about the so-called Neoplatonists. And he was to a less extent Aristotelian. Certainly he was less Aristotelian than, say, the Cappadocians were, or Maximus was. But again, when I say I hate Dionysius, I mean not personally. There is nothing ad personam. I just don't like some of his ideas. And I believe he's quite confusing.
But also wonderful. Now we have two hands. I didn't see actually if Gabriel or Miriam was first. Do any one of you know? Okay, Gabriel is first.
Yes.
Gabriel?
Yes. My question will go perhaps in a different direction that what you have discussed previously. And you said in your discussion, in your response to Dafor's response or analysis, that you see a value in also in modern theology to make use of this Aristotelian or the scholastic method of way of doing theology. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about that, because in my understanding or my vision of theology, at least, theology should be very much close to human beings. And to the concerns of human beings of today. And what benefit do you see in, for example, using it's not that it's old, but it's probably concepts that normal people don't use or have heard of. What benefit do you see in using this kind of method or this kind of theology? For whom is it relevant at all? And why is it relevant at all?
Thank you. Well, I believe that it is relevant. For instance, I've applied this concept, this difference between commonality and particularity, the scholastic framework, to the church. And I think I've done it for the first time. I don't know anyone else who did this. Like, for instance, I differentiate between particularities or hypostasis in the church and the common nature of the church. And I believe that the communities are the hypostasis of the church. I don't believe that patriarchates are the hypostasis of the church, but communities. That's why, well, I believe that communities are more important than supracommunal structures. That's one application of my of this scholastic framework to ecclesiology. Or take anthropology. Take the race issue. You know, racism or nationalism is the same. Because if we apply properly the idea of common human nature and particularities of the common human nature, and we see that we all humans are not divided by our particularities because we belong to the same nature, common nature, we share in the same nature. And this nature is not divided by race or gender, you know, or nationality. Then we see our commonality is more important than our particularities. Well, in a very balanced way, of course, not in the sense of, you know, of the Platonic hierarchization of existence, but in the sense that when I really accept the commonality of the human nature, I cannot believe, you know, in the ideas that, you know, women are inferior to men, or black people are inferior to white people, or whatever, or, you know, Germans are inferior to Serbs. It's nonsense then. But if you depart from this idea of commonality of the human nature, then you easily end up in nationalism, in, you know, racism, in sexism, and all sorts of, you know, disequality. That's why I believe this framework is very helpful to tackle the modern social issues.
Thank you. I think it's Miriam. Yes, Miriam.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I had a super small question. It was just that you were using Abukura, you say in particular Abukura influenced thinkers such as Al-Kindi and Ibn Sina. I was a little bit surprised to see Abukura being the representative here of Christian Arabic Aristotelianism. But who is claiming, is it Awad who claims that he has such an influence over these Muslim thinkers, or
Yeah, well, I think it's quite clear. It has been actually it has been observed that there is a huge similarity between Abukura's categorical apparatus, the categories that he used, with the apparatus of John of Damascus. Well, they belong to the same milieu and they were very similar. And actually, I also observed this similarity between how Abukura defines categories and how John of Damascus did. But certainly it's just one of the examples. There are many cases like that, but well, in my judgment, Abukura was a bridge from Damascus, from the summary of logics, of the Aristotelian logics in John of Damascus, bridging it to the Arabic world. But probably he was not the only bridge.
No, I mean, they usually, I mean, there was a lot of them translating, especially East Syria Christians. And they also say Abukura's work weren't that heavily reproduced at all in Arabic. So maybe it came through someone else, some other.
Yes, well, in the book, I explore some more names than Abukura, but I just showcase Abukura as, you know, as an example of such a bridge from the Greek categories to the Syriac and then Arabic categories.
Thank you.
I think it would be great to study the Muslim appropriation of those particular categories, something that I haven't done.
I think there was a book that came out not long ago, Aristotelianism, Western and Eastern, that discusses this.
Yes, and this
is in my hand, but I don't remember much of it.
Yeah, and there is a great book, actually, just let me, I will tell you exactly.
Meanwhile, I'll just ask, I think I saw Abate's hand. Are you there, Abate? Yeah, it's Johannes Pulkkanen in the note. It's Bradshaw, Aristotle, East and West.
Mm-hmm.
Abate, did you have a question?
Yeah, and there is also a book.
Not really. It is accidental.
Okay. So Cyril, please.
Yeah, I just post on the chat the name of the book. It's by Najib Awad that I've read, and this is a great book on this matter. You can see it on the chat.
Najib George Awad, Orthodox in Arabic terms. Yeah.
Yeah, I read it and I really enjoyed it. And exactly here, he identifies the commonalities between John of Damascus and Abu Qura, and how further these categories were transplanted to the Arabic world. I don't know, Miriam, are you aware about this book?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, I totally believe Abu Qura was very close to John of Damascus. I certainly accept that stuff. It's just that they would then, I mean, this immense translation movement that was going on in this time was so much connected to other people, not really to Abu Qura, as far as I know. I mean, there are so many East Christian translators who work so close to Baghdad, and we know that they influenced the Muslim thinkers so much. So I'm just surprised to see Abu Qura mentioned in this connection, because he must be very not that important as opposed to if you compare with other Christian thinkers. I was just surprised and not.
I actually mentioned I have a paragraph on the Eastern Syriac logics. I can just I actually have it with me right now. Just give me a second. I will post it for you. Where is that? Just one sec.
Meanwhile, someone else who has a reflection. So we have Davor, but we have Grant, and Grant hasn't said anything. So I'll give preference to Grant.
Thank you so well. Just quickly, thank you very much, Father Cyril, for your paper. I just in this whole conversation that it's stimulated, it's helped answer a question for me that I've had for some time, teaching Schmemann and his constant attacks on scholasticism and scholastic theology and the scholastic method of theology. And of course, today, if you teach people that for the first time, they don't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't help to say, well, we can talk about, scholastic theology as the way he understood it and its influences from, Russian theological education and so forth. But what it really does come down to, doesn't it, is that ultimately he paints a romanticized other than the West that his hearers, his readers are wrestling with or reacting against. The more I think about it, it makes so much sense about why Schmemann remains so popular.
Yeah.
There are lots of reasons, of course, but I think that certainly has to be one as well. Regardless of what he means by scholasticism, it's almost irrelevant. It's part of that demonized West.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you. And by the way, I've just posted some names in the Eastern Syriac tradition who dealt with the Aristotelian logics and transmitted or contributed to the transmission of this Greek scholasticism to the Syriac and Arabic world. Yeah.
Thank you. Johannes, you have another one?
I hope this is for your entertainment. I was reminded of a quotation I made. It's from Saint Maximus, the Confessor, because when someone mentioned nominalism and versus realism, I was thinking that these categories are often not adequate or not enough to characterizing the teaching of the fathers. This is the quotation from his ascetical. Let me see, I had it here on screen. I sent it to a person to entertain for some time ago, so you can take it for what it is here. Let me see. And then perhaps I already lost it. Let me see. Yeah, I tried to make it on screen. And so here it is. This is Saint Maximus the Confessor from 200 texts on theology and the incarnate dispensation of the Son of God, written for Thalassius. And this is is a reminder of that it's not easy just to make them scholastics in any very simple sense. Similarly, there are two forms of knowledge. First, there is academic knowledge, which is theoretical information gathered merely from habit about the inner principles of created things, and which serves no purpose because it is not directed towards the practical execution of commandments. Secondly, there is actively effective knowledge, which confers a true experiential apprehension of created things. This is the quotation from, yeah, and merely to put this into realism or nominalism, I don't think it's enough. And that's the problem also with the fathers all the time. If we operate from a very simplistic definition of scholasticism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the points brought against scholasticism, that scholasticism promotes one of two knowledges. Well, the two knowledges of God is the knowledge of God and the knowledge about God. And scholasticism promotes the knowledge about God instead of promoting the knowledge of God. That was the main accusation brought by Florovsky and others. But I think, again, it is a wrong accusation, because scholasticism was not about these two knowledges. It was just a way to better articulate the knowledge of God, or the knowledge about God coming from the knowledge of God. That's why people like Maximus were scholasts. And you cannot accuse Maximus of, just, speculating about God without knowing God.
So it's the definition of scholasticism that is the problem in this case.
Okay, it's the same problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that brings us to a completely different arena, not the purpose of knowledge, which is, of course, something quite different from how knowledge is constructed. What do we have knowledge for? But that's a completely different question. So thank you, Hannes.
Miriam, do you recognize those names? I hope you do. And maybe you have some other suggestions in addition to those translators of the categories to the Eastern Syriac, Persian.
I'm sure there's a lot written. I can find you. I don't know if Dimitri Gutas, if you have. He worked a lot on the translation movement of philosophical works. So I can see if I find that, if that's relevant, and get back. I mean, this is absolutely fine. It's just that there could be better representatives than Abukura of that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's very simple, because I found this monograph on Abukura by Awad. It was so helpful, and well, I just used it.
Yeah.
It's a good monograph. I really recommend it.
So, are there other issues or questions? Someone who would like to?
Didn't Davor have a question?
Yeah, of course. I forgot, Davor. Your hand was there before when Grant wanted to say something, but you forgot it.
No. It's fine. I mean, I've spoken for too long anyway. So no, I just wanted to, if there is nobody else to say something, I wanted to comment on Cyril's remark from before about this search for commonality, or the focus on commonality of human nature versus particularities, with the hope that might prevent those things like racism, nationalism, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of warn there, or that it of course depends how we conceptualize commonality. And actually, the way commonality or common human nature, how it's conceptualized, it can actually be much more oppressive than any particularity. So I don't think that in itself that's a recipe to avoid oppression. And probably the best way is just not to conceptualize human nature at all, and that's the problem also, like with divine nature. So that's and I think it's really what also Samuel said about this way to understand the Cappadocians' approach to the issue of ousia or nature. That it ultimately, the way I see it, is trying to actually correct or get out of this fundamental screw up that Plato got us into when he tried to basically resolve much older problem of one and the many by drawing us into believing that what essentially is our concepts actually has to do with realities out there. And then we are caught up into a completely crazy discussion that's called Western metaphysics, that actually just has to do, I think, with the inability to be very specific that every metaphysics is epistemology. And once we understand that, then actually, and I think that partly, but I think Cyril and Samuel are there, much could be much more specific than I. That partly what they were trying to do is also to respond to this, because in that sense, then both ousia and hypostasis are, at least I want to read them that way. I'm not sure if that's what they were trying to do, but one way to actually make this distance between the disconnect between things as they are that are ultimately beyond the reach of language and concepts, and the language and concepts that, even when used for the purposes of metaphysics, is ultimately just an epistemological horizon, which kind of finally got a little clarified in the modern period.
Well, I agree with that, and I think it's a good point that essentialism can be dangerous. And I'm aware that modern personalism emerged or flourished in response to to Nazism and fascism and all those totalitarian ideologies of the first half of the 20th century, exactly to emphasize the role and the value of individual being versus masses, versus this idea that masses should dominate individuals. But I believe that totalitarian ideologies, they emerged not as a manifestation of essentialism, but rather as a wrong particularization of the common nature. They particularize, they divide the common nature into pieces like Germans, Poles, men, female, homosexuals, heterosexuals, and so forth. Those are wrong particularizations. It's not about essentialism. That's why the idea of the common nature, a really common nature for all human beings, can be also a solution to the problem of totalitarian ideologies, just like personalism is. But again, personalism has its own pitfalls, its own shortcomings, like individualism, for instance.
Yes. We still have a few minutes. It's of course too big issue to discuss, but I'd be interested in how you deal, Cyril, with the relation between the products of medieval scholasticism in the Reformation period and then more modern in relation to revelation or to scriptures. Because I think that there is a connection here between a kind of scholasticism, to put it like that reduces scripture to logic and thus undermines an allegorical and an apocalyptic reading. So it divests texts from the possibility of creating something larger than the pure logic of the text.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I am not very much aware about the transmission of the medieval dialectics into the Reformation, except that Luther really hated Aristotle, and also
very dependent on.
Yes, exactly. That was the sort of hatred that Florovsky had to Scholasticism, very similar. Of course, it helped him to overcome many medieval frameworks of thinking, which were not helpful, which came to be abused eventually, and they were really damaging, the revelation in Christianity. I believe that as well. And certainly, even the Reformation could be perceived as an attempt to overcome the Western scholasticism, and it ended up with its own scholasticism in a kind of ironic way, probably. Maybe that's why just fighting scholasticism is just like fighting, windmills.
Yeah,
As I mentioned in my text. It's pointless.
yeah. If you define scholasticism the way you do, every thinking is scholastic, and then of course you can't fight it by thinking. That doesn't make sense any longer.
Yeah, and I'd like to stress this dualistic dimension in the attitude to scholasticism. People who tend to see world in black and white, in theology, they tend to, to polarize things between, the West and the East. Them evil, us good, or scholasticism and personalists. Those are very wrong dichotomies, and they don't correspond to reality. It's very Manichaean perception of theology, and it's not helpful.